At 72 years old, Evelyn Carter stood on the edge of a quiet suburban street with two worn suitcases at her feet and a lifetime behind a closed door that would never open for her again. Nearly 5 decades of marriage had ended not with a conversation, not with a shared understanding, but with a set of legal papers and a man who no longer looked at her as if she had ever mattered. Her husband, Richard, had taken the house, the savings, the car, and every visible piece of the life they had built together, leaving her with only what she could carry in her hands. To anyone passing by, it looked final, clean, almost ordinary. But what Richard did not realize, what he never stopped to consider, was that Evelyn was walking away with something far more valuable than anything he had claimed, something he had overlooked for years, something that would quietly turn everything he believed he had won into something meaningless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For nearly 5 decades, Evelyn Carter believed she had built a life that would carry her through the rest of her years with quiet stability. The house she shared with Richard Carter was not extravagant, but it held the rhythm of familiarity, morning routines that rarely changed, evenings that settled into a predictable calm, and the kind of structure that made each day feel connected to the last. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared steady, even comfortable, the kind of marriage that had endured long enough to be considered successful without needing to be questioned. Evelyn had shaped that life with patience, attention, and a kind of care that often goes unnoticed precisely because it is always present. She remembered the early years when everything felt new, when decisions were made together, when effort was shared and appreciated in ways that felt genuine. Over time, that balance shifted in ways that were not obvious at first. Like many women of her generation, Evelyn gave more of herself to the life they were building than she ever expected to measure. She adjusted to what was needed, filled the gaps where things fell short, and made sure that the home they lived in continued to function regardless of what changed outside its walls. She was not just a wife in the formal sense of the word. She was the one who held everything together, the one who remembered what mattered, the one who made sure nothing essential was forgotten. It was not something she thought about often, and it was not something she demanded recognition for. It simply became the role she lived in, day after day, year after year, until it felt inseparable from who she was. And when you give that much of yourself to something, when your identity becomes tied to the life you have helped sustain, you do not imagine that it can disappear overnight. You do not prepare for the possibility that one day, the person who stood beside you will begin to see that life differently, not as something shared, but as something that can be divided and reassigned. Evelyn did not notice the change when it first began because it did not arrive in a way that demanded attention. It showed itself in smaller moments, in conversations that felt shorter than they used to be, in decisions that were made without her being included, in a growing distance that was easy to overlook if you were not looking for it. Behind closed doors, Richard's perspective had been shifting long before the divorce papers were ever placed in front of her. What he once saw as a partnership slowly became something he evaluated in terms of practicality and control, something that could be organized, managed, and eventually separated if necessary. He did not express it in a way that caused immediate conflict, and that made it easier for Evelyn to believe that everything remained as it had always been. The absence of obvious tension gave the illusion of stability, even as the foundation beneath it was quietly changing. By the time those changes became impossible to ignore, they had already taken shape into something more permanent. What Evelyn thought was a life built on shared effort had, in Richard's mind, become something defined by ownership, something that could be outlined, calculated, and ultimately claimed. The years they had spent together did not disappear, but the meaning he assigned to them had shifted in a way that left her standing outside of something she once believed she belonged to. And while Evelyn was still holding on to the idea of what their life had been, Richard had already moved on to deciding what it would become without her. The divorce between Evelyn Carter and Richard Carter did not unfold the way most people expect the end of a long marriage to look. There were no raised voices echoing through the house, no final confrontation that forced everything into the open, no moment where anger made the situation feel visible and undeniable. Instead, it happened quietly, almost methodically, as if it were simply another task to be completed. Papers were placed in front of Evelyn, Explanations were given in calm, measured tones, and signatures were added where they were required. The process moved forward without hesitation, without pause, as though everything had already been decided long before she was asked to take part in it. Richard remained composed throughout, focused on the details, attentive to the structure of what was being finalized, but distant in a way that made it clear this was no longer something he felt emotionally connected to. There is a particular kind of shock that does not arrive all at once, but instead settles slowly, making it difficult to fully grasp what is happening in the moment. Evelyn felt that as each document was reviewed, as each section outlined what would remain and what would no longer belong to her. The house she had lived in for decades, the accounts she had once believed were shared, the car she used every day, all of it had been arranged in a way that placed it firmly in Richard's name. It was not presented as something cruel, but as something final, something that followed a logic she had not been part of shaping. By the time the last page was signed, there was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to negotiate, only the quiet understanding that what had once been her life had now been reduced to what could be carried away. When the movers arrived, they did not hesitate. They moved through the house with efficiency, lifting furniture, clearing shelves, packing away objects that had once held meaning without any awareness of what those items represented. To them, it was just another job, another home being emptied and reorganized. To Evelyn, it felt like watching something deeply personal being dismantled piece by piece without any acknowledgement that it had ever belonged to her in a meaningful way. Richard stood nearby, occasionally checking his watch, maintaining the same controlled demeanor he had carried throughout the process. He did not intervene, did not offer explanation, did not look at her in a way that suggested any uncertainty about what was happening. And when it was over, when the last item had been loaded and the house stood nearly empty, he walked away with everything he believed mattered. He did not raise his voice, did not express satisfaction, did not linger long enough to create the possibility of a different outcome. He simply left, carrying with him the life he had chosen to define on his own terms. Evelyn remained behind, standing on the curb with 2 suitcases placed beside her, the space around her suddenly unfamiliar despite the years she had spent there. There was a moment, brief but distinct, where everything seemed to settle into silence. The kind of silence that follows something irreversible, where the absence of sound feels heavier than anything that came before it. Evelyn lowered herself onto the edge of the curb, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze unfocused as she tried to process what had just taken place. It did not feel real in the way she expected it to. There was no clear emotional release, no immediate reaction that matched the scale of what had been lost. Instead, there was a stillness, a pause that seemed to hold everything in place. Everything had been taken, everything that could be listed, measured, and assigned. Everything except one thing. It was not something Richard had considered, not something that appeared in any document or discussion. It existed outside of the framework he had relied on, outside of the way he understood value. And it was still hers. That night, as the light faded and the street grew quiet, Evelyn remained seated with her suitcases beside her, the weight of the day settling in more fully with each passing minute. Without thinking too much about it, she reached into her handbag, her fingers searching for something familiar, something that belonged to her alone. When she felt the small, solid shape resting at the bottom, she paused, her hand lingering there for a moment before pulling it out. The old brass key caught what little light remained, its worn surface reflecting years of use and time. She looked at it more carefully now, her expression shifting slightly as recognition began to take hold. It had been years since she had last thought about what had opened, years since that place had been part of her daily life or even her distant plans. Yet in that moment, sitting alone with nothing left from the life she had known, it became something else entirely. Not just a memory, not just a forgotten detail, but a possibility that had been waiting quietly, untouched by everything that had just been taken from her. By the next morning, Evelyn Carter had made a decision that required no discussion and no permission from anyone who had once been part of her life. With the 2 suitcases placed beside her and the old brass key secured in her coat pocket, she boarded a bus heading away from the city that had just emptied itself of everything familiar. The ride was quiet, marked only by the low hum of the engine and the shifting landscape beyond the window, where rows of houses gradually gave way to open stretches of land, and then to long, narrow roads that seemed to lead somewhere less defined. Evelyn did not rush her thoughts, nor did she try to organize what came next into something certain. For the first time in many years, there was no schedule to follow, no expectation to meet, only the steady movement forward toward a place she had not seen in decades. A small piece of land, hidden away in the woods, left to her years ago by someone who believed it might one day matter, even if it never appeared to. It had never been part of her daily life, never something she relied on, and over time it had simply settled into the background of her memory, untouched and unexamined. On paper, it held very little value, the kind of property that would not attract attention or interest, especially in a process where everything was measured in terms of immediate worth. No one had ever asked about it during the divorce. No one had considered it significant enough to include in the careful division of assets. No one except Evelyn, and even she had not thought about it in years until that moment on the curb when everything else had been taken from her. When the bus finally came to a stop near the edge of a quiet rural road, Evelyn stepped off with a slow, steady motion, her body adjusting to the stillness after hours of movement. The air felt different here, less confined, carrying a scent that belonged to open land and trees rather than pavement and traffic. She began to walk, pulling her suitcase along the uneven ground, following a path that felt both unfamiliar and faintly recognizable at the same time. There were moments when she wondered if she had remembered it correctly, if the place she was heading toward still existed in the way she held it in her mind, but she did not turn back. Each step forward felt like a choice she was making for herself, one that did not depend on approval or certainty. The cabin Evelyn Carter stepped into had not been lived in for years, and it showed in every corner, every surface, every quiet space that had been left untouched by time. Dust had settled into the grain of the wood. The windows were clouded by neglect, and the structure itself carried the weight of seasons it had endured without care. The floor creaked beneath her steps. The air inside felt heavy, and for a brief moment, it would have been easy to turn around and walk away, to decide that starting over here required more than she had left to give. But Evelyn did not come looking for perfection, and she did not need the place to be anything more than what it already was. What she needed was a beginning, something that belonged entirely to her, something that had not been shaped by anyone else's expectations. She started with what she could manage, opening windows to let in air that had not moved through the space in years, sweeping away layers of dust one careful motion at a time, clearing surfaces that slowly began to reveal the structure beneath them. Each task was small on its own, but together they formed a rhythm that gave her days a sense of direction. She gathered fallen branches from outside, stacked them near the fireplace, and after a few attempts, managed to light a fire that brought warmth back into the room. It was not immediate, and it was not easy, but it was hers. That difference mattered more than anything else. The first bread she baked did not turn out the way she had hoped. The texture was too dense, the flavor uneven, and as she sat there looking at it, she felt the quiet weight of starting from a place where nothing was guaranteed. The first week passed without anyone stopping by, without any sign that this place could become something more than a shelter from what she had lost. And at night, when the work was done and the cabin settled into silence, that silence felt larger than the space itself, pressing in on her in a way that made every doubt harder to ignore. But Evelyn kept going, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because stopping would have meant returning to something that no longer existed. She adjusted her methods, tried again, paid closer attention to what worked and what didn't. She found old notebooks left behind, filled with careful handwriting and practical knowledge, recipes, notes, small observations about how to make use of what was available. She read them slowly, applying what she could, testing each idea in her own way. Over time, the bread improved. The process became more familiar, and the space around her began to reflect the effort she was putting into it. She placed a small wooden table near the edge of the road, simple and unpolished, and set out a few items she had made with her own hands. At first, there was no response, only passing cars that did not slow down, moments where she questioned whether anyone would notice at all. But then, gradually, someone stopped. A jar of jam was picked up, examined, and bought without much conversation. Then another person returned a few days later, this time staying a little longer, asking a question, offering a brief smile. It was not immediate success, not a sudden change, but it was enough to continue. As the days turned into weeks, the small garden behind the cabin began to take shape. What had once been overgrown and neglected slowly became organized. Rows of soil turned over, seeds planted, small signs of growth appearing where there had been none before. The table by the road held more items now, bread that had improved, jars filled with preserves, bundles of herbs tied carefully together. People began to recognize the place, not as something unusual, but as something worth stopping for. And slowly, something unexpected happened. What started as a way to survive, a quiet attempt to rebuild something from nothing, began to grow into something with its own rhythm, something that did not depend on what had been taken from her. Evelyn Carter was no longer standing on the curb with 2 suitcases, waiting for something to change. She was creating something, one small step at a time, in a place that had always been hers, even when she had forgotten it. As the weeks passed, what Evelyn Carter had started in quiet uncertainty began to take on a life of its own, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in small, steady shifts that became impossible to ignore. The table she had placed by the roadside was no longer overlooked. It became a place people remembered, a place they returned to without needing a reason beyond what they found there. At first, it was simple curiosity that brought them in, a quick stop, a glance at what she had made, a small purchase made without much conversation. But over time, those brief moments changed. People began to stay a little longer, to ask questions, to come back not because they felt sorry for her situation, but because they valued what she was creating with her own hands. There is a difference between being seen out of sympathy and being recognized for something you have built yourself, and Evelyn began to feel that difference in ways she had not experienced in years. No one who stopped by knew the details of her past. No one saw her as someone who had lost everything, and that absence of judgment gave her a kind of space she had never realized she needed. The bread she baked, the jars she filled, the small garden she tended, all of it spoke for her in a way that did not require explanation. It was enough for people to see the effort, to taste the result, to return because they wanted to, not because they felt they should. For the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Carter was not being defined by the role she once held in someone else's life. She was no longer standing in the background of a shared identity, adjusting herself to fit what was expected. She was simply present in her own space, making decisions that belonged entirely to her, shaping each day based on what she chose to do rather than what was required of her. That shift was not loud. It did not demand attention, but it carried a weight that was deeper than anything she had experienced before. And in that quiet transformation, something settled into place. For the first time in years, she wasn't someone's wife. She wasn't part of a structure that depended on her without acknowledging her. She wasn't defined by what had been taken from her. She was simply herself, standing in a life she was building piece by piece, without needing to look back to understand its value. And then one afternoon, just as Evelyn Carter was arranging a fresh row of jars on the small wooden table by the roadside, a sound reached her that did not belong to the steady rhythm she had grown used to. It was the low, controlled hum of a car engine approaching from the far end of the dirt road, different from the older trucks and familiar vehicles that usually pass through. She did not react immediately, her hands continuing their work as if nothing had changed, but her attention shifted, drawn quietly toward the direction of the sound as it grew closer. The car came into view slowly, moving with a kind of caution that suggested the driver was unsure of what they would find at the end of the path. It rolled forward and then stopped just short of the clearing in front of the cabin, the engine idling for a brief moment before it was turned off. For a second, nothing happened. The stillness returned, but it felt different now, heavier, filled with something that had not been present before. The door opened, and Richard Carter stepped out. Evelyn did not move right away. She remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. There was no visible shock, no immediate reaction that broke the calm she had built for herself over the past months. But the air between them shifted, carrying the weight of everything that had been left unresolved, everything that had not needed to be spoken until now. Richard stood beside the car for a moment, looking around the space as if trying to understand it, his eyes moving from the cabin to the garden, to the table lined with jars, and finally settling on Evelyn. What he saw did not match the version of her he had carried in his mind since the day he drove away. The woman standing in front of him was not the one he had left behind on the curb with 2 suitcases. There was something different in the way she held herself, something quieter but far more certain. He took a few steps forward, stopping just at the edge of the clearing, as though unsure whether he had the right to come any closer. The distance between them was not great, but it was enough to make it clear that whatever stood there now was no longer something he could step back into without question. The man who had taken everything, who had walked away believing he had secured the outcome he wanted, was now standing in front of the one thing he could not touch, the one thing that had never belonged to him, the one thing that had grown stronger in his absence. For a long moment, neither Evelyn Carter nor Richard Carter said anything. The distance between them held more meaning than any words could have filled, shaped not just by what had happened, but by everything that had changed since the last time they stood face to face. Richard's gaze lingered on the cabin, the garden, the small details that made up the life Evelyn had built, and in that quiet observation, something in his expression began to shift. It was no longer the confidence of a man who believed he had everything under control, but the realization of someone seeing the outcome of a choice he could no longer undo. "I thought I took everything," he said at last, his voice lower than it had been before, stripped of the certainty he once carried so easily. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She looked at him steadily, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that came from understanding something he was only beginning to see. "You took everything you understood," she replied. The words settled between them, simple but precise, leaving no room for interpretation. "But you never understood me." Silence followed, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of years that could not be rearranged or rewritten. Richard stood there as if searching for something else to say, something that might change the direction of the moment, but nothing came. The life he had reduced to documents and decisions had taken on a shape he had not expected, one that no longer depended on him in any way. He had come back hoping to fix what he believed could still be repaired, to find some part of what he had left behind still waiting for him. But some things do not remain in place once they are broken, and some moments pass in a way that does not allow them to be revisited. Because while Richard had been taking what he could see, organizing it, claiming it, and walking away with it, Evelyn had been becoming something he never noticed, something that could not be measured or transferred, something that grew quietly in the space he had left behind. And now, standing there in front of her, he understood that what he had overlooked was never something he could take in the first place. As the light of the day began to fade and the quiet of the evening settled once again over the cabin, Evelyn Carter returned to the rhythm she had built for herself, one that no longer depended on what had been lost, but on what continued to grow in its place. Inside, the space carried the warmth of use, the steady presence of something lived in and cared for, not for appearance, but for purpose. She moved through it with ease, her steps no longer uncertain, her hands no longer searching for direction. The notebook rested open on the table, its pages filled with careful writing, each line marking a small step forward, each entry a reminder that this life, unlike the one before it, belonged entirely to her. She did not win because something had been returned to her, and she did not win because someone else had come to understand what they had done too late. What mattered was something far quieter, far more lasting. She had discovered something that had always been there, something no one had the power to take from her, no matter how much they believed they had claimed. It was not written into contracts, it could not be divided or reassigned, and it did not depend on recognition from anyone else. It existed in the choices she now made for herself, in the work she continued to do, in the life she had built piece by piece without needing to look back. Richard Carter eventually turned and walked away from the clearing, carrying with him the understanding that what he had left behind was not something he could return to, not because he was refused, but because it no longer existed in the way he remembered it. And Evelyn, standing in the doorway of the cabin that had become her own, did not follow him with her eyes. She simply stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and returned to the quiet continuity of her day. So let me ask you, if you had to start over at 72, with nothing familiar left to hold on to, could you do it? Could you find something within yourself that had been waiting, something you may not have noticed while life was moving in a different direction? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective might be the one someone else needs to hear. And if this story meant something to you, if it stayed with you in a way that feels personal, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that no matter where we find ourselves, it is never too late to begin again.